endocrine workup, and particularly the way things can go wrong from the moment you write a instruction and you get a report and you interpret it. So this is like a very, very important part of endocrinology, because as against other branches, we are largely dependent upon the reports. So there are a lot of issues which may go wrong and go right, and we will discuss how we can improve the crosstalk between the lab as well as the clinician to achieve a good outcome. So analytical issues are extremely important, and as we will discuss that there are many issues which are there right from writing the investigation to getting a report, how the assay has been analyzed, how the sample has been processed, and how do we interpret the report will have a significant implication in that regards. So when we talk about analytical issues with regards to in this aspect, we need to understand that there are multiple aspects which become relevant from this perspective. You can all go and have a look at our website, learning.growsociety.in, which has got a lot of resources on pediatric endocrinology. There is also a previous session which is available there on this issues. You can look at our courses which are there, our book, and the mobile applications which are there. So what we'll do today is to really go forward towards the nitty-gritties of different aspects of endocrine evaluation. We will be writing a particular sample. This is what we want to get, and we will get a particular lab report. And there are multiple things which can go wrong in that perspective. Now, there could be a problem in terms of that whether we have selected the appropriate test or not, whether we have done it on the right time, whether we have taken in the right sample, whether we have stored it properly, whether the assays were good, the lab is doing fine, and finally analysis. So what we will do focus today is predominantly towards the analytical issue along with the reporting issues and how do we interpret on that. These will be the crux of what we'll discuss, and these are very, very important. So if you look at the errors which may happen in terms of clinical decision making, there are three levels at which problems can happen. We can have a problem at the level of pre-analytical, which basically includes everything which happens before your assay has started. Now, we have discussed already that maybe a lot of errors will happen by that time. Then we have the analytical way in which the problems are more with the assay, the technique, the validation, the accuracy, and those things come up. And finally, there are post-analytical. You've got the report and you have to interpret in that regards. Now, most errors are pre-analytical, 50%. These include the test type, timing, sample, labeling, tube, and all those things. We are going to focus largely on analytical issues today, which are around 30% of these errors. And this include problems in quality control, interference, cross-reactivity. So a lot of these issues will become relevant. Now, what you need to understand is that a lot of things are there as part of lab language, which we as clinicians don't really know very well. So we need to be aware about that. Now, what really is an analyte? Pratik, what is an analyte?
The object which we are trying to measure.
So analyte, so often you will get that analyte and you will get confused. So analyte is nothing. If you want to measure sodium, sodium becomes an analyte. What is the platform? Naveen.
Which it is.
So the machine that you're measuring. So now we have got a lot of these assays, which are the chemiluminescence based assays, in which you can run many portals together. So when you say a platform, it means a particular type of machine which is running that. So all these terms become important. So when you talk about interference, cross-reactivity, these are unique terms which we need to really understand in that situation. Now, 20% error can be post-analytical, and this includes reporting errors, reference range, and we'll discuss a huge amount. This is very important from a pediatric endocrine perspective in that situation and interpretation of results. So now we'll talk mainly about the assay as to what we are really wanting in an assay. So now, Sayan, you can come up here and tell me what all things you want in a good assay.
So like you previously said that I want the assay to be accurate and to be precise.
What else do you want? So if you get these from the lab, you are happy. Otherwise, you're going to go to another lab.
We want a reference range for that age.
So you want the true value. So if you want to measure prolactin, you should measure prolactin. So this is what is known as accuracy. Second, if I measure prolactin today and I measure the same sample kept at, let's say, -20 degrees after a month, I want similar results. and every day if I keep on running, I want similar results. This is known as repeatability, reliability, or precision. So this is precision. Now we all know that precision and accuracy are two different things. So when we say precision, it means that you are getting the same result multiple times. Accuracy means you're getting an accurate result. The third you want is that if you send prolactin, you do not measure growth hormone. So you don't want a non-specific things to happen. So this is what is known as specificity of a particular thing. The other thing you would like to look at is that if you want to measure prolactin, you want to measure prolactin right from maybe 1 or 2 to thousands. You don't want it to only measure till 100 and say that it's more than 100. Many times we get results more than 60, more than 100. Now, what we need to understand is that what is the biological range of that assay. You know that if you have a macroprolactinoma, it can go really huge. So you don't want to any assay to just say more than 60. What is going to be helpful on that? So you want a wide range, which is important. That gives you information about sensitivity. So how low it can detect is the sensitivity. And second, as I hinted earlier, it should be stable. So if I keep it here for maybe a week or so or 2 weeks or whatever, it should not be affected. So that's the assay stability. And finally, you are comparing it with an ideal situation and you want a sort of a reference which standards have been maintained. So for a lab to have a good result, you want a true value which is repeatable, which is giving only about that particular test, which gives you a good sensitivity, stability, and is always validated with a different reference standards, which becomes important from that perspective. So most important of these parameters is, what is the most important? If you're not accurate, I'm not bothered whether you say, okay, every time you draw a picture of an elephant and you draw a dog, you say, I'm very reliable. Every time I draw the same thing. But I am not going to be happy with that. I want somebody who can maybe make some errors in drawing that elephant, but it should look like an elephant. So if your prolactin is 200 and you tell me, okay, 190, 210, 195, 215, it's okay with me. But every time you say 80, 80, 80, 80, that's reliable, but that's not valid. That's precise, but not accurate. So what we are looking at is accuracy. Now, how do you decide on accuracy? Now, that's a very interesting question. What do you really measure in an immunoassay, Pratik?
In the immunoassay, we are measuring the antibody which we are giving separately.
We are just measuring, not even the antibody, we're just measuring the signal produced by that antibody. So we are saying, okay, this is the amount of radioactive substance, this is the amount of light which is being produced. We are not measuring the mass at all. So where does the mass come into the picture? The mass comes into the picture by using standards. So you know that this prolactin is 1 nanogram per ml. This is 2, this is 4, this is 6. You keep on developing that linearity, and based on that, you create a graph. So you say this much amount of radioactivity means 1, this much means 2, this much means 4, and that's how you create the graph. And that's how you convert the unknown. So when you analyze your particular analyte, you say, okay, now this is in this range, it should be that much. So it is an estimate. It's not an actual mass. You're not using a sort of an instrument to measure the weight. It's not a spring balance that you say, okay, now it's this much nanograms. So this is, in a way, a comparison. So you need to have a gold standard based upon which you can actually assess that particular aspect in that regards. Now, if you are comparing a gold standard with your own assay, so suppose you have done prolactin from a lab or from a method which is gold standard, you have done 100 values, you do the 100 values which you have also done, you can just do a correlation. So what you are seeing here is, Naveen, what do you see between the two? One is the gold standard on the y-axis, the x-axis is your lab. How do you think your lab is doing? So as the levels are going up, your levels are also going up. So that means it is correlated. So this is a correlation. Now, a lot of people say, okay, good correlation means you're doing well. Not really. Suppose you are having a systematic error, it's still the correlation will be positive. You will still have a good correlation, but the problem is the error is there. So what is a better measure to compare your results to a reference standard is what is known as a Bland-Altman plot. So what you do in a Bland-Altman plot is that for each value, you see the difference. So your mean for this sample was 100, lab was 120. So difference becomes 20. For a second sample, it was 180. Again, the difference is 20. So how much difference is there for your value compared to the gold standard, which will be on the y-axis, which you see, which is difference between measurements. And on the x-axis is the mean. So 100 and 120, the mean would be 110. So you plot accordingly. So this will be a better way to see how much difference is there in your samples or not. So if you want to develop a new, let's say a technique for developing growth hormone stimulation, which is a new way or a new instrument, you will then compare it to a gold standard and you draw this Bland-Altman plot and do that. Like when we did our bone age assessment, what we did the Tanner-Whitehouse, which was the gold standard, and the app-based reports. So these were the typical Bland-Altman plot that you will like to draw. So this is a crude way in which you can say, okay, your lab is doing fine or not in that perspective. Now, all of these things that are being done are part very much of the quality control of labs. If you need to understand that if your lab is referred as a NABL accredited lab, which automatically means that they have to do so many things. You have to do an external control, you have to do an internal control, you have to do multiple runs every day, which gives a good amount of quality control is already there in the lab. So very important to remember is that lot of the units which have been developed are actually biological units. So what's the unit of TSH? MIU per ml. LH?
IU per ml.
Yes. So what does it mean? You don't know the mass. What is IU? So this is more, people are talking about shifting more towards the mass rather than the IU. What is the conversion for growth hormone from IU to mg? 3. So there is an ideal way, but that international unit is a bioassay. So people talk about a mass assay as a reference and not as a biological activity, which becomes important from that perspective. Now, having a standard is very, very important. When you say this is 200 grams, let's say, how do you know this is 200 grams?
According to another weight.
And that another weight, how do you know it is 200 grams? So how do you know?
You need to measure it.
So measure what? So somebody has written 200 doesn't mean that that's 200. I said this is not 200. How will you be able to prove that that is 200? Sign. Or I say this is 20 centimeters and by based on scale, but I say that scale may be wrong.
So it has to be based on some gold standard.
So where is the gold standard?
So the people who are making those weights.
Everywhere in the world for these parameters, like there is a standard international unit. In Paris, there would be a particular substance of a particular metal. They'll say this alloy, this much dimension, it's actually there, that is 1 kilogram. So that 1 kilogram becomes a gold standard for everywhere. So all the kilograms will have to be traced to that. So maybe what you said, this was 1, I made another 1, and then you use this, and Pratik made another 10 out of that. So you can trace that particular 1 kg. Okay, where did you get? I got from Pratik, I got from Naveen, I got from Falana. Then you go finally, you have to be traced to that particular, this is the standard. Similarly, there are standards for second, so time, place, everything. So there are standards. So the problem with endocrinology was, when you say growth hormone bioassay, every lab will have a different bioassay. When you say growth hormone, you can have growth hormone isoforms. Some growth hormone are 22 kilodalton, which I'll talk about, so are 20 kilodalton, which is relevant. So all these things cause the confusion. So on that, there are a lot of work which is going on in terms of validation. This is the Pediatric Endocrine Society guidelines in 2016, which very clearly mention what you want to assess. It tells that you look at 22K growth hormone isoforms, and that too, they said there is a reference IS 98574. So there has to be a place where this growth hormone is stored. Based upon that concentration, all the calibrators, all the standards have to come from. So this is the way you're trying to standardize. Because if somebody says this is 1 picogram, somebody says this is 2 picogram, if the values are different, the whole purpose is defeated. So that's why standardization started from there, and for growth hormone, assays have become better. So you need to know which is the standard your lab is following, and is it following it appropriately or not is a very, very important thing to remember. Now, why is it important? Now, growth hormone we know circulates in 22 kilodaltons and 20 kilodaltons. Maybe 10% of it is 20 kilodaltons. So suppose your lab, you have one lab, lab A, which measures both, and lab B, which measures just the 22 kilodalton. What will happen? Which one will give higher readings? Level A will give 10% higher reading. So if you use the same cutoff for both, no point. So that's why we have to be very clear as to whether our standards are there or not, and that standards have been validated or not in that situation. Now, certain conditions, there are no standards. You can't have gold standards. So if you talk about LH or if you talk about HCG, there are 20s of LH and HCG going around. Some are glycosylated, some are adenylated, some have so many modifications. So how do you develop a particular reference for that? That becomes a big problem. There is no gold standard in that situation. So what you do in that setting would be is to actually measure the lab means. The other way would be that you send the same sample to 100 labs. Okay, you send samples to 100 labs and then you calculate a mean. Because there is no gold standard, then you assume that this mean becomes a gold standard. And then you correct your value for that mean. Did you get it? So suppose you send a LH to 100 labs and you find that the mean value is 2. So that means that 2 is the actual value. This is what you assume. Your lab is giving 1.8, which means you are giving 10%, 90% value is what you are giving from that perspective. So next time, if your lab is actually giving 3, you make it more. You correct it. You say I'm giving 90%, so this has to be 3 into 10 upon 9. Did you get it, Pratik? So what I'm trying to say is that this is another way in which you try to make all labs similar. That was standardization, which means you make standard. This is the same for everything. But where standardization is not possible, you do something else. You try to bring everybody on the same platform. And this is known as, when you bring a noise to a particular level, what do you call it? Harmonization. So this is what is known as harmonization. So this is, you're trying to create a harmony. So there's noise, you're trying to come down. So what you do is that this is known as a Euden's plot, in which you have got one sample, you take 2 samples, sample Y and X. And then for these are different labs, they are showing their values. And if your lab is coming in between that circle, which is the 30% variability, which is allowed, you are doing fine. If you are going beyond that, it means that your lab is doing something wrong, which you have to assess. So this is a process of external validation, and harmonization can also be used in that perspective. So you take 2 samples, lab data, and you can allow up to 30% variation. So if you are, so these all labs are doing fine, this lab is out of the proportion, so this is not doing fine in that perspective, which you will find. Now, very important effect to remember is the carryover effect. Now, what do you mean by carryover? Can you think about it? Fine.
Some previous sample being carried over to this sample.
Yes. So if you had a TSH of 3000 and your tube, it is stuck, next time it can give you a falsely high reading. So this is what is known as a carryover effect. So what it basically means is that if you have a very, very large sample which is stuck on the tubes, you can have an erroneous result. So this is a possibility. There are ways which already the machines work on it, which say that if the level is this much more, you do even more rigorous wash, you can avoid it. But this is something which can go wrong. So what I'm trying to do, say, is that whenever you get a report which is inconsistent with your clinical finding, you have to think of various possibilities. One of this is this result, and this is what happened to us some time ago. A child was on 100 micrograms of thyronorm, his TSH was reported as 54. He looked totally fine, good compliance, euthyroid and everything. We did a repeat TSH, which was found to be 2.5. So then everybody got into action as to what went wrong, why was this result 54 and now it is 2.5. So what was wrong was that the same day when the lot was done, just before that somebody's TSH was very high, and that can cause a confusion. So this you have to be very, very careful about carryover effect being case. So we have discussed a lot about accuracy, which is basically when you talk about accuracy, how are you performing against a gold standard? And how are you performing against your peers? So it is something like that. You give an exam, how many marks do you get? That is your external control. And what percentile you get is the interlab variation. This is what we try to do. And when we say harmonize, harmonize will be inappropriate that we will give everybody same marks, which is not the correct way. The correct way would be that curve that if you are beyond this, you are not doing well. This is what you need to know from that perspective. So now we've discussed about accuracy, which is most important. The next step is precision. So as I said, precision means that every time you do it, you're doing at the same place, whether it is right or wrong, we are not bothered about that. So why do you think is precision important, Naveen? When it is not accurate, is precision important or not?
So you can do both accurate and precise.
If it is accurate, it has to be precise. See, if it's 100% accurate, it has to be precise. The problem with accuracy assays are they are very difficult. You need to have an external lab control, which will come to you, which will go to 100 labs and all those things. So you can't keep on doing the external control continuously. So what precision also tells you that if you are in the external control, you are okay, and your precision is also okay, that means that you're doing fine. So why is it important and easy is that suppose you run, you've got level of control. So this is done via control. So every kit will come with controls, and in endocrinology, there will be 3 levels of control. Low, L1, middle, L2, and L3 will be high. And you keep on running those controls. And you see whether your daily reading will not be same. It will never be same. But whether it is in the acceptable range or not. If you keep on measuring the weight of this every day, it will not be the same because there will be some error. But if it is, let's say it was 200, one day it comes 190, second day it comes 210, then 190, it's okay. If it continuously say 210, 210, 210, it is precise, but there is something wrong. You're giving a higher reading based upon that. So similarly, you have a known thing which is there. Every day you measure that and see if your levels are fluctuating both sides. If your reports are fluctuating on both sides of the graph, you're doing fine. If you are only going one side of the graph, there is a problem. If you're deviating hugely, suppose it is 200, you say it's 400, then you don't have to, there's something wrong. So what these strict criteria say is that if there are particular rules which are there, if you're going away from those rules, your lab has to stop. You have to take corrective measures and then you can run the sample. So these are the acute controls. So external control is more like a examination which happens once a year. Internal control is like daily tests. So teacher is taking you daily and you are able to answer it correctly or not. If you're not, you'll say, okay, you're not fit enough to take test, you read and come back. So this is the basic difference you need to understand from that situation. So basically what happens with precision is that you look like this. So what is happening is suppose you have got somebody whose measure is 4. And then these are all lines which are there and you know how much standard deviation is there. So you need some data to come in. You need to have at least 20 days data to get the right thing in. You need to have run the same assay for 20 days. Then it will make meaningful. And then you use your own data for follow-up. So how you were performing for 20 days. In this test, you were getting on an average 10. Today you have got 4. There is something wrong with you. So this is what the same thing. So now if you look at the first part of the graph, what do you see? Sign.
So just the first part of the graph.
This graph, yeah, this section.
So on an average, it is accurate and also precise.
So it's going both sides. And the difference you see is like 0.2. So 0.2 would mean basically somewhere like 5% or something. Now you will set a limit. as to what you want. It is not for the lab person to decide. You can say, okay, for TSH, what percent you are okay, what percent you are happy. But if you look grossly, or you can put SD limits, +2 SDS, +3 SDS, what will be the site you will say, I'll stop doing the work. So many labs will say that if your reading goes above 3 SDS, then you have to stop and review. Some say if you are continuously positive SDS for so many days, it's like growth failure. So if your height is less than -3 SDS, height is -2, you are losing height, same. So if you have done one big error, you stop there. If you are erroneously there, you do it after a few days. If you are only on one side also, they will say after 7 days, there is something wrong. This means there is a systematic error. You are positively giving a higher value. So those things. But if you look at this graph, going up, going down, going up, going down, this is fine. Nothing to be done. This is both accurate and precise. What about this, Naveen?
So this is not accurate, sir, and it is going precise because it is going only on the negative side and there is no up and down.
So what it means is that there is some problem in calibration. So you are measuring levels which are 20% lower. So you are inaccurate, but you are precise. This is what
Worsening.
that depends upon that, how you see it. So maybe this is a very 3-day graph only, but what you're seeing here clearly is that your variations in terms of levels are not very high, but you are consistently on the negative side. So this is something you have to be worried about. What about this one? What do you see,
It is
Pratik?
not precise because the range is so high and it is not coming close to the mean, also not accurate.
If you look at the mean, it will be accurate.
Not accurate.
So what it is trying, which is worse, the second one or the third one?
Third one
Third one is worse.
is going deviating totally away.
Okay, what you need to understand is that suppose you measure a height. You have got two persons who measure height. One says it always gives 10 centimeters shorter than the other. The other sometimes gives 10 lower, 10 higher. Who will be better? So what it means is this is a systematic error. The second one, there is a problem in your assay. You have to correct it. This may just be randomly. 3-4 days you may have a problem and it may go off like that. So the second is the actual problem which is happening with your assay and your quality control. So if I have a problem which is there on the second one, I'll definitely do a proper lab analysis, run more controls, do some calibration and see what's going wrong on that. So a systematic error is always worse than a random error. Random error can happen randomly and you don't have any control on that. But if you have a systematic error, you have a control on that systematic part. This is important to understand. Now, how do you really measure? Now, these are just the graphs. You can't just go by graphs. The best measure of precision is what is known as coefficient of variation or CV. And every time when you go to the lab, they will say, we are doing very fine, our CVs are good. But what really is CV? You got the number here, standard deviation upon mean. What does it mean?
Sir, once he said that like estrogen has high coefficient of variation at lower levels.
So you need to know that there is this much is the standard deviation, but that standard deviation has to be corrected for the mean. If your value is 200 and you have a standard deviation of 2, your CV is 1%. But your mean is 20 and your standard deviation is 2, it becomes 10%. So CV is taking into two things. Mean is a measure of central tendency, and standard deviation is a measure of dispersion. So what CV is doing is it is actually telling you how much is the dispersion as compared to the mean. If you remember correctly, I said that for weight, one standard deviation is 10%, while for height, it is 5% or 6%. So therefore, you know that for a given SD, depending upon the mean, it makes more sense. So this is a very good measure. It just looks, okay, this much is your dispersion and this much is your mean. This is how you. Now, if you look at this, what could be the other thing that you can think of? Can you remember of something else that we do the same way? If you look at the standard deviation score, that is also a similar thing. Observe minus expected upon expected. So that's basically you're correcting it for the mean so that you know how much is the person deviated. This is for an overall performance, that is for an individual. So this is what CV is. And ideally, within a same assay, it should be less than 10%. Now, these are rules. These are not some hard and fast things. What you need to understand that within the same assay, it should be less than 10%. Between two assays, it should be less than 15%. So if you compare your lab to another lab, it should be less than 15%. So you are allowing up to 15% variability. This is important. What does it mean? If the glucose in your lab is 100, you are allowing other lab to have 85 to 150. If you have a 15% inter-lab variability. If you talk about same lab, you say 90. If I measure the same next minute, it may be 90 or 110. This is a very, very important concept to remember, that these reports that you get are not absolute. There are CVs, and CVs may cause variation. And this is important from a clinical perspective. And patients will be angry that, okay, abhi 90 tha, next day it's 110. How does it happen? This is part of the CV. This is what the lab is allowed to do that. Now, if you look at basically, this is the graph, mean and ST, we all know about that in that perspective. Now, what you need to remember is that it is not just the lab, there is a biological variability. If I do your glucose today and I use the same lab and do the glucose tomorrow, do you think they will be the same? What are the two components which decide they will not be same? One is the lab variability. Second is, so whether you have eaten some rasgulla or not, whether you have done exercise or not, it will vary. So this is the way it will differ. So there's a biological variability and there is a laboratory variability. Now, which is more going to affect your results, generally speaking? So biological variability is huge. You need to understand that everything will have a huge biological variability. Now, there are ways in which you can decide how much of your CV is good for you or not. So this is an example. So if your analytical standard deviation to a biological standard deviation is 1 to 4, which means that your analytical variation is 1/4 of your biological variation. In that case, only 3% of error would be because of test characteristic. Now, this sounds confusing. Let's say your sugar is 100 and you know that your sugar, because of your biological variability, can vary by 50 points. So that 50 will become biological SD. If your glucose SD is 12.5, in that case, you said 12.5, then only 3% of the error will be because of your test, 97% will be because of your biological variation. This is very important because patient will say, I did a test from the lab, this was this much, I did from the glucometer, this was this much. So you have to explain that glucometers, let's say 12.5% is their precision or their CV. In that situation, 97% of changes is what you have eaten, what you have walked, whether you slept or not, you took the medicine or not, all those things will become important. So this concept becomes important. This is important because this will decide what CV is acceptable to you or not. If you go the other way around, suppose you say, I set the CV at half. If 50 is the variability for biological variability for glucose, I say 25. Then 12% of error will be because of the test. So as you increase the CV, the error because of the test will increase. So now you can understand that, okay, for TSH, the variability is 1000%. Now, how much should be our CV? That we can understand. So if somebody says, okay, CV is 20%, you will say 20%, that's huge. But what does it mean? The variation may be, let's say day-to-day variation is 100%, because TSH can definitely vary so much, 100% easily. In a day, it can vary 40 to 50% anyway. So then you say 20% is not bad. If you have 100% variation day-to-day biologically, 20% variation because of lab will give you less than 3% error. So you need to keep that in perspective and understand. But generally speaking, 10 and 15% is what the labs target in their perspective. Now, this is an example, 12-year-old boy, 21 hydroxylase deficiency on hydrocortisone, 17 OHP is 4. Now, people repeated after 2 days, it was 2.4. So now somebody said that 3 is the value. Now, some people are very, very finicky about the levels. That 3 is the value I want, exactly 3. So now this we need to increase the dose, and 2.3 we need to decrease the dose, or it is all right in that perspective. So what's going wrong here? Prateek, what do you think?
Because the CV of the test is something.
Yes, the CV of the test is very, very important. So what is the CV in this case? If you have a CV of 20% and your value is 3, it can be 2.4. So this much variation can happen normally. So that's why clinicians will not just go on to one test. If you say your TSH cutoff is 4.5, your value is 5, and you have an obese child, I would say, hold on, nothing to worry, because we are tuned. So don't get dogmatic about these values and reference ranges, which I'll talk again later on. But there are CV which is going to affect that. So this is what the effect of CV could be in that situation. So now, how do you use the CV? Which amount is acceptable and which is not acceptable to you? So as a rule, as I said, 10 and 15 is the target. But if your CV is more than 20%, you don't accept the result. This is a general rule. Now, this is a very, very interesting graph which shows the analyte concentration on the x-axis and the CV on the y-axis. How do you interpret it, Naveen? What do you see here? As the concentration goes down, what happens? And as the concentration goes up, what happens?
The CV comes down to the.
So as the initially the concentration goes down, the CV goes up. There seems to be an optimal concentration, and then it goes up again. So what it means is that this assay we have to use only for those points where the CV is 20%. You get the point? It will give you a result. It will give you a result even at 0.1 or something. But you should only use in this case between 5 and 90. So that is the optimal reference interval where this test should be done. This is very important. Because what happens is that you have glucometers. These glucometers were developed initially for diabetes patients. Now their sugars is 300, 400. Now you want to measure in neonatal hypoglycemia, which is 20, 30. Their CV will be huge. So this CV may go up to 80%. So 80% CV means what? Your level is 20, it may be 36 or even 4. So there'll be a huge variation. So use the limits only till the time they are 20% CV is there. This is a very, very important concept in that regards. Same is true for estrogen. When you measure estrogen in males or estrogen in young girls, the CV will be huge because the CV will be, it's been made only for reproductive age women who have levels of 100 to 200. So if you have 20, 30, of course the CV will be high. Same will be true for testosterone in young males and in adolescent females because the CV will be high. So either you develop an assay which is got for that particular range, or you be careful about that interpretation. So this is what is important. So now we have discussed about the precision. The next issue is specificity. What do you mean by specificity?
So like in like we want to measure cortisol, but we also measure cortisone.
Yeah.
So the test is not specific.
So this is important. There is an analytical specificity and clinical specificity. Clinical specificity is we want to talk about data. That is to detect a test which is negative. How many of them are negative? That is clinical specificity. Don't get confused. When you talk about analytical specificity, it means that if you are measuring prolactin, you are measuring prolactin. You're not measuring something else in that situation. So how do you calculate and what affects specificity? One is cross-reactivity. So if you have a similar structure, you can cross-react. So this will happen with similar compounds and this will be predictable. You will be able to say, okay, this test measures cortisol, but maybe 5% also it measures cortisol. 1% it measures prednisolone. 0.1% it will measure dexamethasone. So you can do, there are studies which will be done and the kit will tell you how much is the cross-reactivity. So you can understand that. So they will be predictable. There will be a dose response curve which you can draw and you can do that. This is particularly important for steroids because steroids are a nemesis to assess for an immune assay. Why? Why are steroids not good for immune assays?
They are very similar to each other.
They're very similar, they're very small. Peptides are huge, so you can develop this epitope, that epitope, you can do multiple antibodies. Steroids are small. So they are small, they are pretty similar, so they're not very good for these amino acids. So this is a big problem, especially for steroids and for things like LH, FSH, HCG, and TSH, which have got the same alpha unit. So they can be confusing on that regards. Now, what is interference? So one is cross-reactivity, when you have two chemicals which will react similarly because your antibodies are made in such a fashion that they will react to a particular epitope. Interference is different. Interference has nothing to do with other substance which is similar in structure. It can be because of something else which has happened to the sample. When you say sample rejected, what's the most common cause of sample rejected? Yes, and
Less quantity.
quantity less. Yes, that is good, but that is an error of the pre-analytical error. So you said hemolysis. Icterus, of course, is important. Many times they will say that, and lipemic samples. So if you have lipemic samples, so if you have all that, they will interfere with your particular assay because you don't know what will happen with hemolysis. So icterus, hemolysis will become, you can sometimes have unknown factors which may interfere with the assays, and this is something which is unpredictable. So if you have a bizarre report, you are expecting that your TSH will be thousands and you get a TSH of 1, there's something wrong. So you have to think of interference, not cross-reactivity in that setting. Now, how can you improve cross-reactivity? You develop more sites. That will be better. But what will be the best way to remove cross-reactivity, Pratik?
Go by the mass.
Yes, if you do a mass spectroscopy, that is a different thing altogether. You're doing it in a different assay. So that's why it will be better. The whole issue of this is not there. What the immunoassays are doing they are like blind people looking at elephants. That's what we said. So you're looking at one part of the elephant while keeping your eyes closed. Okay, this epitope looks like LH. But somebody will say this can be HCG also. So I'll find some other epitope. So you have two blind people looking at that. So there will be a confusion. While mass spectroscopy is everything in open, you can easily compare that. That's of course more expensive, more complicated. Everything may be a factor there. So how do you measure cross-reactivity? You have a target analyte and you have a cross-reacting analyte. Why is the cross-reacting analyte on the right-hand side? Naveen. This is a dose response curve. So analyte and that. Of course, if your cross-reacting was on the left side, then what is the use of the assay? That means your cross-reactant is producing much more signal as compared to that. So of course, your cross-reacting will always be on the right side because it will be interfering, but it will not be the primary thing. So what you do at the half response point, you compare what is the concentration. So what you see here is that around 200, your target analyte is producing 50% of response. While for the cross-reacting analyte, this is 2000. So that means the cross-reactivity is 10%. Which means if you have this much, so how would you do? You know that this is a cortisol, this much concentration, you add cortisone on that. And then you measure how much cortisone is measured based on that. So this is how you measure cross-reactivity in that perspective. Another form of interference, I've talked about icterus, hemolysis, is the hook effect. So what really hook effect is, we've discussed it a lot on prolactin and all those things in that regards, is a simple error of non-competitive immunoassays. So for non-competitive immunoassays, you need to have a baseline antibody. You've got to have the substance. And then you need to have the second antibody, which is there. If you've got huge amount of analyte, if the analyte is hundreds of times more than what you're calculating, suppose you say it was 20, but you are having 20,000, then that analyte cannot bind. All the analyte cannot, of course, bind to the standard or the static region. You will have lots of it in the circulation. As soon as you add the antibody, the second antibody, it will bind to that and it will wash it off. So you will have an initial linear response which happens, and then that linear response comes down, which basically is what is known as the hook effect. And it is relevant for things which increase hugely. So they will include and HCG and which thing rises hugely? Which test rises hugely? You see it very often. TSH. So tumor markers, AFP, CA, calcitonin, so all those things. So HCG, prolactin, TSH, calcitonin will rise. Now, how can you prevent hook effect from happening? This is a secondary thing. You're thinking of hook effect and you do that. But now the lab people are also quite intelligent. We've been talking about hook effect for a long time, but they have to have devised some mechanism to prevent the hook effect. So what can you do?
So they can first ask for the clinical symptoms and then go for the.
Everything is automated now. You put the sample and you do it. So what they do now is that once you have got this initial step, you've got this antibody which is coated, you put the analyte, you wash it completely. You wash it so thoroughly that all your excess analyte goes off. Analyte means that prolactin, whatever extra prolactin is washed off. So now how will this prolactin bind to that second step? So this is a very good way. So if you have a very rigorous wash process in which you remove all the excess analyte, in that situation, you are not going to have a problem with regards to the hook effect. No, it's already bound. So whatever it is, it's bound to the, see, if you have got 100 binding sites, all are bound. Now, after 100, you wash it. So it will go to a, it will keep on high, it won't go down at least. Now, what happens is that you have to then add the secondary, it will bind only to those 100 sites. What happens is that you've got so much prolactin that it takes off the remaining part of the second antibody. You don't even bind to 100 sites, and that's the thing. So you wash out, so whatever is bound is already stabilized there. So wash after initial banding could be a option which you can use in that perspective. Now, this is a classical example we always talk about. A 16-year-old girl with galactorrhea with a prolactin which is normal, but who had headache and vomiting and a large adenoma. So when you have a discrepancy between, so if you have a large adenoma with a normal prolactin, but why do you have galactorrhea? So this is a major problem. If you don't have a galactorrhea, then you can think it's non-functional or whatever. It's a supracellular lesion. So what we'll do here is that you can do a dilutional sample and you will find that the levels were really high. Now, some very interesting types of interference can happen because of antibodies. Now, whatever we are talking about is all antibodies, because what we do is chemiluminescence. So these are the most common errors which happen. Suppose you are measuring a particular substance, there is also an antibody against that substance in the blood. What will happen? Sign. Signal will decrease. If you are using a competitive assay, what will happen?
Then signal will increase.
Signal will decrease, but you, because it's inversely proportional, you will say that the level is high. So this is the example. Suppose you have an antibody against a particular substance, it won't allow it to bind to the target antibody. It will basically drag it out. So your level will be falsely low. This is a very, very important thing in thyroid cancer. Very, very important. So if you actually have an antibody, your levels will be falsely low. This happens again more with non-competitive assay. With competitive assay, level will be high, but not to a particular level. So it's because all of us are doing non-competitive assays, you have to be more clear about these concepts. And you can correct it by using a GCMS, of course. Now, why I'm saying this is very important in thyroid cancer is, Pratik, you will tell me?
Because we have to measure thyroglobulin level after the surgery. So if it is positive, we are amount for repeat surgery or RAI.
Yeah.
So it can come falsely low in that.
Yes. So thyroglobulin levels are measured as markers of thyroid tissue in a treated patient with thyroid carcinoma. If your TG is negative, you are happy, nothing is there, that's fine. But suppose somebody develops a TG antibody, thyroglobulin antibody. That thyroglobulin antibody may falsely reassure you that there is no thyroglobulin and you will be happy. So this is a very, very important concept to remember in that perspective. So this is a 17-year-old girl, follow-up case of thyroid malignancy. What you found, everything was done, thyroglobulin was undetectable, but then somebody thought there was something wrong. They did a scan which showed a lesion. So what went wrong? There was actually an anti-thyroglobulin antibody. So anybody whom you are monitoring TG, you should also do a anti-thyroid immunoglobulin to avoid this confusion. So if there is an autoantibody, now you think about autoantibodies, where all autoantibodies are there. TSH, TSH antibodies. Which proteins do you get the antibodies? Which you measure basically, TG, insulin. You can get anti-insulin antibodies, it may cause confusion. PTH, sometimes you can get antibodies, but when you are saying TSH, it is TSH receptor blocking antibody. It's not the TSH antibody. So these problems can happen in an autoimmune situation. So this is an interesting thing. The other very interesting thing is what is known as heterophile antibodies. So what is heterophile antibodies, Sai?
Antibody is not similar in structure.
So it binds to other compounds similar in structure to underlying.
Heterophile antibodies are also known as anti-animal antibodies. So basically, everybody of us, if somebody is exposed to animals like zookeepers, veterinarians, they will develop antibodies because of scratches and everything. But even otherwise, because our immune system is not perfect, you will have some form of a heterophile antibodies which are there. Maybe 1 to 2% will have a heterophile antibody. Now, this heterophile antibodies, why is it important? If you go up and read any of these SOPs or their inserts on these kits, you will say, what are the enzymes which are there? What are the antibodies there? They will say rabbit antibody. Some will say horse-related antibodies. So there are a lot of these antibodies are actually, and many of these substances are not always monoclonal. They could actually be part of these antibodies which are there from the animal this thing. So now, if somebody is intelligent enough, they can tell me what will happen if you have a heterophile antibodies. That antibodies can do two things. First is this. What is happening here?
So it will prevent the thing from binding.
So atypical. That's what we talked about in the TG case. So this will give you a falsely low result. Or you can have that they will link both antibodies. So this is linking to this and this is linking to this. You've got no analyte at all. You have got no TSH, but because your antibody is linking to antibody 1 and antibody 2, so both of them can be linked. So if you have a bizarre high or a bizarre low reading, this could be because of a heterophile antibody. So these are going deep into the thing, but as pediatric endocrinologists, you should be aware that you will get these reports and you will say, okay, what's happening? We need to have an answer or at least give a logical explanation as to what can happen. So what you do here is you go to a different platform. Why different platforms, Pratik?
You will get the same report every time you do it in different, and those antibodies will be there.
So the antibodies may be different for a different platform. So these are not, when we say, when you give insulin, there is a reaction. The reaction is more because of the diluent, not because of the insulin. So you say, okay, you switch from Humalog to Novorapid. Maybe no, the response will not be happening. Same way, maybe when you do it via, let's say, Roche machine, there is this problem is happening. You do using a different machine, maybe a Abbott machine, you will find a different result. So they could, because they are using different antibody, they're not using rabbit, they are using mouse for all you know. So these things can improve with a different platform. Rarely you can do a dilutional study. So you can dilutionally, you will say it is not linear. Of course, that will be the case. And there is a way you can mop off these antibodies. But I would say if you have a problem with, let's say in a very crude sense, if you're getting it done from SRL, if you get one report which is bizarre, you get it from Lal Pathology or you get it from somewhere else, which use a different platform. Now, if everybody is using Roche, there's no point. So you need to be aware about what your laboratory is using. And therein comes the inter-lab comparison, which becomes important, which is a part of the quality control which happens. Now we have discussed a lot about interference. There is another very important thing is what is known as a matrix effect. So what is matrix? Naveen? Anything around us is a matrix. Matrix is like our environment. Wherever we are living, we are in a particular matrix. Now, in context of a particular analyte, when you say matrix, is where is that particular analyte? if you want to measure sodium in the blood, sodium in the plasma, sodium in the serum, sodium in the urine, do you think same machine, same analysis, same validation will work for all? No. Or maybe no. You don't know what happens because you will have many other factors in urine, many other factors in blood, many other factors in plasma which may interfere with your result. So matrix is the overall environment which can affect the result of your sample. This is very, very important. In matrix, what happens is the effect of environment, and this is because most things are labeled for serum. But if you send, instead of that serum, you send plasma, or you say, I want to do a urine sample, then you can't say that whatever validation you have done, whatever your lab is doing is correct also for urine. It is only for serum. So you have to ideally establish it for every possible assay. So if a lab says you can take plasma, you can take serum, you can take whole blood, it means they've done all the studies. One classical example is renin activity. How do you send renin activity?
How do you send?
What sample?
Frozen sample, like what the
What sample? Plasma, serum, blood. So it's plasma renin activity, simple. Plasma ACTH. But if you send serum sample, a lot of people will do that. They don't know, they'll send serum. You will have a falsely low level. Okay, if you do a serum level, your level will be falsely low. How can you say that this was a plasma and this was a serum? Which test will help you differentiate between a plasma value versus a serum value? Pratik. Anything else? What does the plasma vial have? EDTA? So you do a calcium level. So if it was EDTA, all the calcium would have been taken up by this EDTA. So your calcium will be very low. So if suppose you are expecting his renin will be very high and renin is low, you say, okay, hold on, what is the calcium? They say the calcium is only 1. Is the child having seizures? Then you understand, no, this was right. This was actually a EDTA. But if they say calcium is 12, it means that there was a problem. They have sent a serum rather than a plasma sample. So basic understanding will be helpful. Now, this is very, very difficult to do. So don't do, like, you can do that, but don't rely on that report. So this is supposed to be measuring serum sodium. You're doing urinary sodium. It's up to you. You can interpret whatever. There may be variations which may happen in the same thing. Suppose you do a plain water. If you just send plain water, what do you think will be the result of, let's say you want to measure TSH. Can plain water have a value or not? Ideally not. But you don't know what the matrix effect can do. And you can have some problem because it was measured for serum, not for plain water. So this is important from that perspective. The other is binding protein, in which we all know how binding proteins influence for TBG, for CBG, for all those things. So you can interfere with binding, and these are all the common ones which we remember. So other way is extraction. You remove it and then you bind and do the assay. But if you do a simultaneous total and that hormone, you are pretty much okay in that situation to identify that. So this is important from an analytical perspective. So now we have this child who presented to us with lethargy. Free T4 was found to be low and TSH was found to be normal. And what happened is that there was no other complaints. Everything was normal. T3 and T4 levels were normal later on. So what's going on here? There is some form of antibodies which is influencing the results, which can affect that. So this is, you need to do a different assay. This could be a heterophile antibody which is causing this problem. We have a particular patient who comes, he was always getting TSH done from Lal pathology and his TSH was never high. He had very low T3, T4 and TSH was always normal, 1, 2, 3 or something. Now, everybody was saying, okay, you are normal, nothing to be done, but he was classically hypothyroid. So when he came to me, I thought that this looks like a central hypothyroidism. Let's do the whole work. From our lab, we got the TSH level more than 100. So it was more than 100. So it came out, this is primary hypothyroidism. We started treatment. Then again, he got the test done from the previous lab. Again, he found that his TSH was low, while T3, T4 was low when he had stopped treatment. So there was basically a problem in that particular lab in which TSH was falsely low in that situation. And that probably would be a heterophile antibody which is causing. And when we did from our lab, which used a different antibody, it was different. So these things do happen in clinical practice. Now, we all know that there can be other problems like prolactin circulates in various forms in the body. So you have got different forms of prolactin, monomeric, dimeric, and macroprolactin. And as your mass increases, the biological activity per mass becomes less. So your monomeric will be the strongest ratio for bioactivity versus mass, lowest for macroprolactin. So you may have a clinical situation where there are no symptoms of hyperprolactinemia, but your prolactin levels are high. This is known as macroprolactin, and you have to do a pegylated study in that situation. So this is the biological activity ratio in that regards. So 14-year-old boy with gynecomastia, normal pubertal development, LHFS is normal, testo is all right for this particular level, prolactin is 120. So Pratik will always tell you that this prolactin is not the cause of his gynecomastia, because for prolactin to causing gynecomastia, you should have hypogonadism. So this is basically a problem of a macroprolactin where nothing needs to be done. It's just a pegylated study which will help you out in terms of that. So now we have discussed a lot with regards to the accuracy, to the precision, to the specificity. Now we come to the next few couple of things which we'll finish it off, is the range and the sensitivity of that particular assay, which is quite important from a clinical perspective. So when you say sensitivity, it is how low you can measure a particular compound. So you read about TSH, first generation TSH, second generation TSH, ultra sensitive TSH. What does ultra sensitive mean?
Detection at the low.
So this is nothing. This is like a gimmick for marketing. So when you say earlier assays used to measure 0.1, then somebody said 0.01, somebody said 0.001. So you can measure maybe 0.00001, but how is it going to make a difference? But this is what it means. Ultra sensitive means just that you are not better at measuring 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. You are just going down in terms of measures. This is what sensitivity means. So when you say sensitivity, what really is sensitivity? How do you define that this is the lowest you can measure? Pratik.
Below that, you get the same result.
Will you get zero result?
The same result in the lowest point.
So how do you define that? See, zero you will never get. There'll be whatever things will be there, because this is not a mass. This is not like you're measuring like a spring balance and Newton's balance that you're measuring. You are measuring signals. Some noise will always be there. So what people use is a term known as limit of detection. Limit of detection is basically you take a null sample. You know that this sample has got 0 TSH, and you run multiple assays with that null sample, and you say this much is the mean, this is SD. So anybody who is within the 3 SD, you don't count that. This is 0, and then beyond 3 SD is your limit of detection. Now, what is relevant for you is the limit of detection or limit of reliable detection. We discussed this earlier. So you want not just that, okay, I'm measuring this is 0.1, but this 0.1 is not reliable, so I'm not bothered about that. What you're mainly looking at, now this will depend upon which antibody you use, signal use, so all these things. So the radioimmunoassays, the competitive assays will never be very sensitive, because they are polyclonal antibodies, and it's like the inverse ratio also, so it will never be very sensitive. But when you talk about chemiluminescence, they can become very, very sensitive if your detection. So if you have this much signal also you are seeing, this depends upon how well you collect that signal. So if your sensitivity for the signal is good, you can measure any level. This is what happens. Now, what you're actually looking at is not limit of detection, you're looking at limit of quantification. That is the point at which you reliably measure your particular level. That is, your CV is less than 20%. So your limit of detection may be right up there, but you can have a CV of 80%, which is of no use. What you're looking at is a limit of a CV of 20%, which becomes important from that perspective. So 14-year-old boy with delayed puberty, testicular volume is 4, testosterone on one result was undetectable, second result was 24. Parents are very angry. Somebody is saying he's got 0 testosterone, and now somebody is saying his testosterone is there. What's happening, Sayan, here?
Testosterone should be low for the age. just entering glucose.
So basically what is happening here is a CV issue, simple issue, that at lower range your CV is higher. That's the only point. So you say, what is the significance? There is no significance. Basically what is happening is that you say less than 20, I will not report. And suppose it is 20. So now if you have a 20% variation, it could be 16 and 24. In the first assay, it was 16 to 20. So somebody said undetectable. It does not mean that it is undetectable. So when you say undetectable, it is unreportable. There is nothing called undetectable. You can detect anything, but whether you are detecting it right or not is important. So the lab has a convention that if it is 16 to 20, less than 20, I'm not going to report it. This is what happens. So when you talk about this is an issue that you have basically done a higher CV at this level. So what you can do a GCMS, which will give you a better result in this situation. So we talked about sensitivity. The next issue is stability. How long is your sample stable? Very important. So you need to know how long is your sample stable at room temperature, at 2 to 6, which is the normal refrigerator, -20, -70. This all is there in the kit. You can read it and very easy to identify. Then how long your reagent is stable. And because lab, they will buy a reagent. The kit has 100 samples. Now suppose you have bought a kit for, let's say, some SHBG or something which you're doing once a month. And of course, you have to change it every month. So it has, the stability becomes important. Otherwise, you'll be having a problem because with time, their values go off. As for glucometer, they say the battery is now dying, so your levels may got variable. The same thing will happen obviously with this thing. And of course, the assay will also deteriorate over time. So 20-day-old girl with seizures, sugar is 22, GIR is high, ketone is normal, so non-ketotic, normal cortisol response, insulin undetectable. Problem? So you have not done it properly. You have kept it, sample was unstable. So because you kept the sample and you were sleeping, the person was drinking pee, by the time he reached there, the lab technician was dozing off, he took it and it take a long time. And this is a problem of sample instability. So you have to be careful about this. This is actually a pre-analytical issue in that situation. Finally, when you get the report, you have to compare it with something. And this is very, very important. And we are all fixated with reference interval. Now, is it reference interval or reference range? What is the range? What do you know by what is range? Range is actually a single figure. When you say range, like if you say this is the mean, this is the minimum and maximum. Range is actually just the difference. So if you say 10 to 30, range is 20. Interval is 10 to 30. So this is reference interval, not reference range. Why don't we call it normal range? Because there is nothing called a normal range. What do you mean by normal range? If you have 20% people who are TPO positive, whether you keep those 20% TPO positive when you're developing your TSH range is a question or not. These 20 are normal or not. This becomes a question. They will pull your TSH towards the other side. So these things become important. So this we all know about the bell curve, how the distribution is. This is how the normal distribution should be, but there is no normal distribution in most cases. You have to be careful about that. Ideally, you need 120 sample for each particular group. So if you have to create a IGF-1 reference, you need from 1 to 18, that is 18 into 2, that is male and female, that is 36 into 120, that is like 5,000. So the minimum samples you require to create a reference range in children is 5,000. And you get 300, 400, so it is not going to make any sense. So while we are so obsessed with reference intervals, remember that this needs to be interpreted appropriately. The second thing is that you talk about this is like a statistical definition, of course. And suppose your sample is not in a normal distribution, you transform log transformation, and then you can calculate STS. Now, very importantly, often you don't know the specific range. Now, range is there, but it is, as I said, is of no value. I am concerned about a particular level. You are asked by a pediatrician, okay, what TSH level shall I treat? You say, okay, the range is for this age group is 0.2 to 2, then it is 0.2 to 5, then it becomes 0.2 to 4. He's asking you a simple question. What particular level is the threshold for action? So how do you decide that, sir?
So the level beyond which there are complications.
So of course, that is a different way of defining. How do you define that? So first of all, you need to have a gold standard. When should you treat? So you need to know that there's a gold standard beyond that. And then you use your levels, because if you don't have a gold standard, you don't know what your sensitivity is, you don't know what your specificity is. But when you want to know the cutoff, you draw something like this. This is known as, what is this curve known as? Naveen? Pratik? So this is known as receiver operator characteristic, ROC curve. This is the fundamental thing you need to know about when you're talking about reference range, development, and actionable cutoffs. See, I'm not bothered about range. Your glucose is, some normal person's range is 70 to 110. So what? I want to know if your fasting is more than 126, you have diabetes. That is more important for me. So how you do is that on one side, the y-axis, you have true positive, which is sensitivity. And on the x-axis, you have false positive, which is basically 1 minus specificity. And for every reference range, every level, you draw how much is the sensitivity, how much is the specificity. And you draw the curve like this. So if, suppose I say, how do you know that this curve is good? Closer it is to the y-axis. So if you see this curve, closer it is to the y-axis, the better the test is. And then you calculate the area under the curve. How do you calculate the area under the curve? So suppose you have got this whole square, you assume it as 1. If you have this triangle, what will be your area under the curve? 50%. This means your test is useless. You flip a coin, 50% it's right, 50% it's wrong. So 0.5 is useless. If you have just touching that 100% line, what will happen? Your area under the curve will be 1. That will be brilliant. That whatever level you do, it is always positive. So you want your area under the curve above 0.7, 0.7, and ideally above 0.9. That will be a good test to think of. And then you decide, I want more sensitivity, I want less sensitivity, I want more specificity, you can decide which cutoff will be there. So this is how your ROC things are done. So this is what we've discussed about the analytical issues, which itself had been a big discussion point. So we'll discuss about the post-analytical a bit later, but we'll maybe close at this point of time. The key issues and key messages are that you need to be concerned about precision, about accuracy, about stability, sensitivity, specificity, and range. These things will give you a clue.